punto primero de consejo es, de mi experiencia, es ser detallista y riguroso al observar
Very thorough and rigorous when observing and recording things that may be relevant.
se basan solo en los recuerdos, sino en los registros, toma notas, toma
Take
fotografías
notes, take
y graba
photos,
vídeos de
take
conversaciones
videos
donde
of
pueden
conversations
hacerlo.
whenever you can,
Y,
whenever it is possible.
de mi experiencia,
And from my experience,
necesitan
I can
hacer
tell you
copias
that
de
you
seguridad
need
o enviar copias a un fuente seguro y
to be based
confiable
on safe,
como un
reliable
abogado.
sources,
No se
like
trata de decir
like an
que el
attorney. Don't
agua
limit yourselves to
contaminante
saying
tenga
that
un mal sabor,
the polluted
sino que
water had a
sugiere
bad flavor, had a bad taste,
analysis, un
but
abogado y como
suggest
Rosa Maria
this
ha
analysis to
dicho
a
hace
lawyer.
pocos
And as
minutos.
Rosa Maria said
Y,
a few moments ago,
por ejemplo, no se limitan a decir
don't
que
limit
la
yourselves to
policía
saying
vino y
just that the
utilizó
police
la
came
violencia, sino
and
que
used
tengo que
violence.
descifrar los nombres, los
Instead,
números,
instead try
los
to write down
contratos, etcétera,
the
etcétera.
registration or the
Y
licenses of those involved.
el segundo punto
And the second point
es que
is that
mucho antes de que alguien piense de emprender
before
acciones
anybody, way
legales,
before anybody thinks of filing any legal
pueden
actions,
buscar señales
you
de
can look for
advertencia y
signs of
información
warning
antes
and
de que
information
los proyectos
before
comiencen
projects
a
begin.
realizarse. Esto es
They,
difícil
before the project itself
porque las
begins, which
empresas
is difficult
confían en el
because
secreto de
companies
sus planes y afirman que la
trust the secrecy
información
of their plans,
que buscamos es confidencial,
and they say that the
pero
information that we're
con
looking for
ayuda
is
de
private, is
expertos
confidential. But with the
pueden
help of experts,
investigar cosas
you can research or
muy
investigate things,
importantes.
very important
Y
things,
quiero
and
darles pocos
I
ejemplos
want to give you a
de
few examples
información que
of
pueden
information
ser de relevancia,
that can be relevant,
especialmente para
particularly
tomar acción
to take
contra
action
empresas
against
internacionales y
international
en
companies
tribunales
and
internacionales, por
before
ejemplo,
international courts, for
Inglaterra,
instance, in England,
Francia,
France,
holandesa, etcétera, etcétera.
the Netherlands, etc.
Así, uh, ¿qué tipos de información puede
So,
ser
what types of
útil?
information could be useful?
Unos ejemplos.
Let's see some examples.
La estructura cooperativa, la matriz, los
The
subsidiarios,
cooperative
afiliados,
structure
acciones,
or the
¿quiénes
affiliated
son estos?
companies
Segundo
in this
ejemplo.
mining activity, first
¿Quiénes
of all.
son
Secondly,
directores?
who
A veces hay
are the
responsabilidad
top managers?
personal
Sometimes
de
there
directores.
is an individual
¿Quiénes
responsibility of the
son
of
banqueros y
management. Who are
financieros?
the
Muy
bankers and the
importante
financiers?
para
This is very
hacer
important
acción
in order to
contra ellos.
start any action against them.
Otra cosa, ¿cuál
Another
bolsa que
thing,
cotiza los accionistas? Muy importante, hay
shareholders.
información en las bolsas de relevancia.
Sometimes
Otro
there's important
ejemplo,
information at the stock exchanges,
son
for instance.
es la
Something else.
empresa miembro
Is the
de
company a member
asociación comerciales,
of
por
trade
ejemplo,
associations?
EITI,
For instance,
Extractive Industry
EITA,
Transparency Initiative, or
Extractive
Bonsuco,
Industries Transparency Initiative, or Bonsuco,
azúcar,
in the case of sugar.
otro tema importante.
And another important
Y
topic.
¿qué son los contratos y licencias públicos?
What are
Y
the contracts and the
quizás
public licenses? Which are they?
escribiré esta información
You may think that this information is very difficult to collect, but
es posible
it
a
is
veces
possible
con ayuda.
sometimes
Y ah, también
with help.
ah, hay información
And there's also
sobre las
information
cadenas de suministro,
about the supply
los
chains,
mercados, el dinero.
the markets,
Decimos
the money.
en mi oficina, seguir
We
el
say in
dinero,
our office, follow the
arriba y
money,
abajo.
up
Y
and down.
arriba hay
At the top,
préstamos de banqueros,
there are
muy importante,
bankers' loans,
las fuentes
and
de
something that is important, the
suministro,
supply
ah,
sources
de cual obtienen la empresa
from which the
mercados
company
para producir, um, mercados,
finds
suministro
markets
de ganadería,
for
carnes
them,
para productos
ranching,
legal
felling,
y ilegal.
legal and illegal
Y
products,
en la suministra
soybean,
abajo,
and supply
¿quiénes
at the bottom.
son los clientes,
Who are the
los
clients?
compradores?
Who are the buyers?
¿Y cómo pueden encontrar información?
How can you
Y
find
creo que
information?
hay cuatro métodos
I think that there are
básicos.
4 basic methods.
Uno,
1,
investigando por sí mismo. Dos,
researching, doing some
el
research by
derecho
yourselves.
de
Number
información.
2, the right to
Tres,
information.
los
Number
órdenes
3,
de la corte.
court orders.
Y cuatro,
And 4,
con el ayuda de
with the
expertos
help of experts,
independientes.
of
No
independent
hay
experts.
suficiente tiempo
There isn't
para
enough
hablar
time
de todos,
to talk about
pero
these 4,
investigando por sí
but
mismo. Número
you can
uno,
do some research by
mucha
yourselves.
información
Number 1,
en línea o
there's a lot of
registros
information online
públicos.
or in public
Si
registries.
saben dónde
If you know
buscar,
where to look for
hay
it.
informes anuales de las
There are yearly
empresas.
reports produced by the
En un
companies,
caso sobre contaminación en Putumayo,
and in a case on contamination in Putumayo
fui involucrado.
that was involved.
Esos informes fueron muy importantes
Those reports
para
were very
mostrar
important to
el grado
show
de control
the degree of
de
control
matriz sobre la
of the
subsidiaria
parent
en
company
Colombia.
over the subsidiary in
Y
Colombia.
obviamente
And
hay
obviously,
páginas de web y
there are
yo
web
recuerdo
pages.
el Wayback Machine,
But
las
I
páginas
remember
antiguas
the Webmac
eliminadas
machine
y
that,
hay muchas
in old
ONGs
pages that were
que
deleted. And
puedan
there are many NGOs
ayudar
that can help,
para buscar
that can help you
este tipo de información.
find
Y
this type
creo
of
que
information.
Somo ha hablado antes.
And I think that Samo referred to
Y
this before.
no voy a decir más
I'm not
de
going to
derecho
say
a la
more about the
información
right to
sobre la
information
corte, pero
or
hay
the
muchos
court orders,
expertos
but I
independientes
can tell you that there are
y
many independent
puedo
experts,
enviar un documento
and I
con
can
los
send you a
nombres,
document with their names.
pero ejemplo Somo,
But for
que
instance,
conocen,
Somo,
Inclusive Development
whom you know,
International,
Inclusive Development International,
tiene mucha información
has a lot
sobre
of information
banqueros y
regarding bankers
financieros,
and financiers
préstamos, etcétera,
and loans
etcétera,
and so forth and so on,
y muchos otros.
and many others.
Pero
But
la cosa la más
the
importante,
most important thing,
para mí, es la
in my view,
colaboración
is
entre
the
los
collaboration
abogados en Colombia y las
that is created
comunidades en
between
Colombia
lawyers in
y
Colombia
los
and the communities in
autores
Colombia
como yo
and
en
lawyers like
Inglaterra.
me in England.
Si pueden todos colaborarnos
And
juntos,
if you can all
es
together
posible a veces
collaborate
tomar
with us,
acción
it is possible then to
efectivo
take effective
en
action before the international courts
las empresas
against
poderosas
powerful
internacionales
companies,
grandes.
multinationals.
Muchas gracias
Thank you.
y puedo tratar de
I
responder
can try to
preguntas, pero
answer your questions,
próximo Peter
but
repetir.
Peter is next. Thank you, Richard. Okay, as you wish. Peter? No, we're going to entertain questions from our audience for Peter and for Maria Rosa. Do we have any comments? Or are we really tired?
Peter.
Peter? Richard. Richard. How can we solve a problem that is of a great impact in the Bay of Cartagena and Canal del Dique and the Juan Gomez marshland, where multinationals have taken over this territory and they have contaminated the whole Laconer system, and the community has been affected. Everybody, all the communities have been displaced. We have a problem of social displacement of all the population that lived there. Richard,
Yes,
are you there?
yes, and I think I will reply in English
Okay.
so it can be translated.
Vale,
Um,
one second,
But
Richard.
thank you. And yes, I have seen some of the pollution in the Bay of Cartagena with members of the community and my colleague and friend Adil Melendez.
Richard,
And
hold on a second, Richard. ¿Ya? Okay. ¿Puedes repetir, por favor? Can you repeat, please?
Yes, thank you for the question. And I have seen from a boat the contamination in the Bay of Cartagena with some leaders of the community and with my good friend and colleague Adil Melendez. But it is a very complex problem and it depends on many things. But firstly, there's the evidence, the scientific evidence of the source of the contamination. Secondly, there is the question of whether those responsible have broken Colombian law, whether the environmental law or pollution law or human rights law, for example, by failing to consult with campesino or indigenous communities. Then after that, there is a question of seeing if action can be taken against those companies, either in Colombia or if they are based in England or Spain or France, in those countries. And I would be happy to speak separately about this because it is very complicated in my experience. But there are, in each case, 5 or 6 important questions that need to be asked to see if reparation or restoration or compensation may be possible. It is not easy, but there have been many examples. And I don't know if other speakers have talked about it, but yesterday, the families of the banana farmers and workers who were killed many years ago celebrated a victory in the United States against Chiquita Company. And that is an example of what can be done, although it also shows it is a slow and difficult process. But I spent 2 years ago 4 days in court arguing about the differences between caducidad and prescription in Colombia and England. But usually the rule is that even if action is taken in England or France or Germany, the courts there will apply the law where the damage took place, so Colombia. And so when I was involved representing campesinos in Putumayo against an English oil company, we had to work with our Colombian lawyer colleagues to understand Colombian law. And so in England, for example, the period of prescription is usually 6 years, but in the case that I had, even though it was for Colombian campesinos, the judge applied Colombian law, which is often 2 years, and I'm not an expert on Colombian law, so Rosa Maria and others will know more, but in our case, it was 2 years for a group action or 10 years for other actions. But that is why it's very important for the international and foreign lawyers to collaborate with the communities who know the facts and the details, and with the Colombian lawyers who can put together all the pieces of the jigsaw. Again, I'm sorry that that is a long answer, but the period of prescription is a very important factor, because often it takes time between when damage starts and pollution happens and when an action can be begun.
Primero también hay que pensar de los diferentes posibles niveles de responsabilidad. No creo que tenga, si pensamos así.
To review all these levels of responsibility. This is not a complete list, but a company may have a very, a responsibility, but they could be, and their responsibility could not be as significant. Sometimes there's a company that has used their a terror framework that has been offered by the state, and they have used it to really defend their interest. That there's another company that tries to protect human rights, for example. Maybe they can prevent getting into problems. They might have a minor responsibility, so we have different levels of responsibility or accountability, but we can talk about this in more detail. Knowing about those different levels, there are companies that finance terror. In the case of Chiquita, the case of Drummond, where they paid an army to kill union members, to evict peasants from their land. And sometimes it's a company who gets involved after human rights violations. Some of the cases that CAJAR, in this sort of black line, there was a series of massacres back in 2001. And after those massacres, the state offers a lot of oil licenses in that area. So those companies that bought those concessions, the question is, do they know about the massacres? Did they order those massacres and then they came to the country? So really, depending on the evidence, we can talk about different levels of responsibility. There are other companies that, in the case of Drummond, for example, if we don't want to talk about a company, they were beginning their operations when they began with paramilitary in 1996, 1997, around their sites. So determining So determining the responsibility really depends upon the strategy of, the gathering of evidence, and that could enable us or establish greater responsibilities. For example, the crime, or maybe an authority that is not as responsible or less, or is less responsible. And there's another of aiding and abetting, which is also a crime in this country. But we can talk about that later on. I could explain a lot more about the levels of responsibility, but time is of the essence, so we can talk about this in the clinics later on. So what we need is to have a strategy of evidence gathering. And if we go to the next slide, please, one of the ways that we can begin to gather evidence is to establish context, to begin to study the timing, the timeline, the benefit ways. Let's go to the next one. The timeline, the history. How did the company begin to operate in the country? What happens when they were awarded the mining concession? What was the timeline? What happened? Did they came into before the massacres, during, after? How was that period? Do we know whether the company was being financed by, whether financing the army? Maybe do we know if those platoons maybe were working with the paramilitaries? We can think about the Chiquita case. Chiquita had worked hand in hand with the Cordoba platoon, and they managed a lot of convivir groups or paramilitary groups. And they asked other mining companies, do you want to finance this structure? So we can see that very close, narrow, very tight alliance. Were there killings, or again, the union members, advocates? What was the history? And when did it happen? When did those crimes occur? What was happening? Well, I would like to emphasize on this, because sometimes when we have communities, usually they just kill somebody. Somebody received a threat. Of course, it's a tragedy, but sometimes we lose the data. Who was that person? That person had been in the meeting with the company that day prior to his to being assassinated, and he had filed a complaint between the before the Attorney General's office, for example. So many of the evidence really lie on the communities. Many evidence. A lot of the evidence are in the communities. So please record that. So, considering what Richard said, this work could be dangerous. It's not about doing this with a lot of noise, but just think about how to do this so as not to lose sight of those elements. What do we know about direct financing to the arming? Drummond financed the pop-up platoon or battalion. They also, we have evidence that Drummond gave money to finance the paramilitary group Juan Andres Alvarez, who operated in the area. I know they financed other paramilitary structures. We know that according to testimonials with commanders, we had that strategy. So for them to have the El Silencio farm, we know that financing lasted in time. If we know that a company is financing for 10 years a platoon or battalion, even if the company hadn't asked to kill peasants, but they insisted on financing, we see some level of responsibility in that case. Now, geography, the space. just like with the timeline and the history, is to find patterns, repetitions in the history. Every step, every year that the company announces a new mining project, there's another sort of strike of so many people killed, and company announces that they will begin operations in such and such a place. Before they announce a project, and then the same thing happens with paramilitaries, and then another project in another. So we have three different points with similar scenarios. So it's more than just being careless. That we need to take into account all those different elements. Then we need to study the benefits. And benefits is also a compelling way to establish. And Rosa could maybe talk about the benefits that are not. For me, they're the benefits. What are the benefits for the company? Security. On the one hand, when we talk about security, we are talking about maybe moving the guerrilla out of the area and moving them to the north of the Sahara, the paramilitaries. That strategy against the guerrilla was also the umbrella that helped them to kill the people that are activists, that defenders with the co-opting language of defense.
Two, the union members, the environmentalists, etc. Then the stripping of the land, the eviction of people from their land. So many cases on this. Montes de Maria. We could name so many around the country and find cases of eviction. And this is crucial. And then impunity. Impunity itself. We must say that impunity is not by accident. It's part of the strategy. If the conflict is used to advance economic interests, those economic interests are not interested in losing everything if peace comes. So a mechanism must be found to limit these investigations. So when you find, why did Chiquita, was it successful in the United States but not here? Why Drummond? In 2012, 2013, several paramilitary were found guilty and condemned, and the court ordered the Attorney General's office to investigate several members of top management in the company. More than 10 years have gone by, and so far only 2 top-level executives have faced any type of prosecution. Omission, silence in violation to human rights, silence in the approval of evidence that undermine rights to the environment or to investigation, silence of the company given the persistence of the military protection. Why is it? The immunity, the military immunity, it allows for certain crimes not to be defined as violations of human rights, and they continue in the martial courts. The issue is that this allows these courts to become the center of impunity. When there are cases involving the army, the evidence is lost. So omission in that sense, too. Let's move to the other one. Each one of these 3 elements above allows us to put together a context, which is a 3-dimensional context, trying to narrow down the space for the company. Now, if we move to the next one, just to say that these elements could be combined with the few direct evidences that we could have. There might be some items of evidence, for instance, declarations of paramilitaries before the courts of justice and peace. And here you have to be careful. At the beginning, when this whole process started, many paramilitaries were willing to negotiate. If you accept this case for me, I will pay you such and such. There were a lot of lies there. So there were some important declarations that could then be compared against other evidential items. For instance, if a paramilitary says, we pushed these peasants away for Drummond, and then we see that the farm is in the hands of Drummond, well, there was support there. So we can see that there is some evidence before the courts, even though not much progress has been attained. Also, declarations from witnesses and compass documents, etc. So, if we put together the study of times, spaces, benefits with the few evidential items, we can have some elements there to base ourselves on. Let's go back to Chiquita. Very few times will a company write on a document, go and kill these people. Chiquita, well, it was a matter of a feeling of impunity. They wrote everything for us in the United States. So this went out of control, and well, the tragedy was that at the beginning, when this first came out, they simply paid a penalty in the United States under the story that paramilitaries had extorted them, even though they were funding the Cordoba battalion and the exports of banana were increasing and they were killing union members during strikes. And one last comment. There may be items of evidence outside the country. Someone said many times they don't tell us, but many times the plants, the multinational companies are in their own headquarters, and they have discussed with ministries of foreign affairs, with ministries of mines, etc. For instance, in Colombia, the mining cadastre was done in the 1950s by the United States. So you have that information. They already located the most strategic and economically interesting points in Colombia. But you cannot rely on these interpretations immediately. These are reserves, and we can go for them when the right time comes. So that's what it is. There may be very important elements, evidential elements. When I worked for Amnesty, we tried to get access to a publication for the mining industry called McKinsey, that were studies written for the companies, and we were not allowed to read it. Why? Because there was evidence of where are the mining plants in the CAJAR, for instance. I was trying to prove that as we evidenced new mining contributions, there was yet another streak of massacres. And there was a pattern being followed in the cases of La Loma. Well, there were cases in La Loma, and then the projects in Descanso Norte. We have these clashes and measures to push peasants away from areas like Mechoacán, Platanar, etc., even evicting them from the domination of Barbie, known as Barbie. And the last one. No, there isn't a last one. That's it. That's the end. I was going to say something in relation to what Richard told us, Richard and Rosa. But when I saw your image about your topic in relation to evidence, I thought that this is a little better now. Okay, there's the situation that we were looking at recently. According to the work that we have been doing with communities in the territory, as Rosa said, there's one of those keys in the legal language of courts and tribunals where you always have to expect things to go for the worst, but sometimes there are pearls that are left here and there. And one of our cases have to do with insisting on the biocultural rights, which is an idea that is related, that is linked to how Without the communities, there would be no life, no nature, no territory, and vice versa. So it's a relationship that must be looked at from the wisdom, from the knowledge, and the feelings of the communities and the peoples. So one of the things that came out and that we were asking ourselves was how to have evidence of that discussion, because it used to be that there was always a denial in that the peoples had this relationship. And one of the things that we saw was this issue of the black line with the Sierra Nevada peoples. So the anthropological expert's opinion was of the utmost importance. It's not a classical anthropologic thing. It's from the perspective of the communities and the different peoples. We found recently another case in San Miguel del Progreso in the Guerrero Mountain in Mexico, where this exercise of anthropological expert view was used too. So I wanted to ask you, how could we use these experts' method? Have you ever approached it? Because this notion of territoriality that we referred to yesterday is systematically denied by the state justice. They say the notion of territory is limited to what we say territory and territoriality is. How can we, based on other different elements, prove that? Because if there's no river, there's no community. If there's no marshland, there's no community. If there's no mountain, there is no community, which is where our doubt is. And we were wondering whether you have ever resorted to that in your work. We're going to pick up several questions, and then we will hear the different answers to the different questions. Taking into account that we have the evidence, we have the proof, and on the other hand, there are decisions of the courts issued. For instance, when Dow Chemical put this chemical in the Cartagena Bay about 30 years ago, they generated this ecological damage. But this ecological damage brought about the consequence that fishermen at that time that made a living out of fishing in that area, the consequence that was that they could not perform that activity. So the decision was given in relation to the ecosystem. But the effect that this had on the community and on the fishing activity was not looked at. So if there's a court decision issued, what can we do so that those lights or that evidence goes beyond this point and it goes to actually taking into account the activity that was taking place in that area? More than a question, this is a contribution to what Rosa said and to what Peter said. And it is that sometimes we have the evidence, but we don't see it. One proof of this is that last year we were in San Jose de Ure, and in their coat d'arms, they have this little fish. In the logo, they have this fish, and in their songs, they name this little fish. And that fish is almost gone because of the Cerro Matoso mine. So we don't realize that evidence lies in something that is very close to you, that is in this river that used to be there and that doesn't run there anymore. Because sometimes these type of evidence can be useful too. An animal, a species that no longer exists at this place where they used to live. Peter, Richard, or Rosa, would you like to answer the questions? My question is about the compiling of evidence, and if you classify them or sort them by categories, like some evidence can be compiled specifically by the community. And I want to know in which entities can we find these items of evidence? Is there a place where communities or lawyers can go and hear from the lawyers? Here you're going to find this, this, and this, and the communities have to compile this, this, and this. This is important for us as a community or as a team that gives advice or is part of the different communities so that we can work, geared to achieving the objectives that are pursued. I would begin by the last thing that you said. Yes, it is good to have a list, something that will make a framework, but there are exercises where it is better if I have the facts, if I have the truth or what I consider to be the truth, I have to go through the exercise of how would I prove it? How can I make it evident? And you can have 1,000 things that would come up here. And then you go through the exercise of sorting them and to say, okay, this is documentary evidence, this is testimonial evidence. No, you cannot be a witness because you're a party here. So, yes, these could be expert witnesses. And expert witnesses, I don't mean the engineers and professionals. No, the people in the community are experts too. That fight has begun, and we have to continue it because the more it is there, more recognition will have these expert testimonial from the community. Then you have pictures, photos. People say, I can prove that I had my donkey. Look at the picture where my daughter used to ride when I used to have my donkey. Yes, you have to analyze that picture. You have to say, no, this photo doesn't have a date. We don't know the camera with which it was taken. And today, in this virtual world with artificial intelligence, this is going to become a problem. But it turns out that that picture I can complement with somebody's testimonial. And then at the end, one could say, oh, you didn't like my evidence? Okay, show me. Show me that this is false. Challenge it. Challenge it. You are the one, you, company, have to come up with an evidence to show that my expert did not do it correctly. Because if we're based on a list,
con mayor
if we base ourselves on a list, we may see what our colleague was just saying, in that we may have evidence, but how can I prove it? So it's best to go, okay, how can I prove this in 1,000 different ways? Go through the exercise and rule certain things out. No, I cannot go like this. This I will take to the United Nations because I know that the rapporteur will like this. But if you're before a judge, oh no, I better keep these 3 because I know that I'll nail it. I know that they cannot be attacked. Now, as to Jose's question, actually, I feel that this is a new topic in our discussions. We have to accompany this reflection, and there are organizations that are supporting the defense of Decree 1500, for instance. How can you support that? I don't know how to explain this, but perhaps Peter or Richard can explain it. All the processes of social and environmental conflicts need interdisciplinarity. Anely Alvear, a professor at Antioquia University, niece of Jose Alvear Restrepo, by the way, she says, even transdisciplinarity is required. If, in a legal process, I come with the idea that the core and the center is the legal part, and the article that says that the evidence has to have the water stamp of these and that, if we do that, we'll be in trouble, because I need to keep this balance between what the anthropologist says, what the geologist says, hydrogeologist, and the wise man in the community. Everything has to be pushed forward in such a way that it'll keep a balance. And I think that Santiago talked about the chair to you yesterday, right? Did he use my metaphor of the chair? Did he talk about the chair? Well, Oscar knows the story. I don't know.
Es que Oscar está aquí en la repetición. Bueno, pero mire que si yo les digo qué pasa si a la silla donde
If I
usted
ask
está se
you,
le cae una
what
pata,
if that chair that you're sitting on loses one of its legs? It would fall down. I use these expressions because they are really helpful. For instance, when you're in a community, if I go and I say the strategies that must be considered are A, B, C, and D, and strategy A is the legal strategy, they won't get it. But if instead of that, I tell them, okay, just imagine a chair and it's missing one leg. What would happen? They will never forget that. So I'll pass the mic to Peter to continue with the chair and the legs.
¿Se escucha? Richard, did you want to say something? You're muted. Yep. Oh, no,
Okay. Peter, were you going?
Yeah,
now,
no, but it's
or-
just if you had any reactions to the questions, but it's I can go ahead if you want. It's up to you.
Well, yes, again, I'll answer in English. But I agree completely with Rosa Maria, and evidence is about building up a picture, and I agree also with Peter, from lots of different sources and with detail. If testimony is just that after the company started operations, some children got sick playing in the river, then that is not very detailed, credible evidence compared to evidence that on the 4th of June, after the company started, 5 children whose names are this started coughing and were being sick. And we have a photo of these, and we took one of them to the doctor, and we have a doctor's report. Then that is much more important than vague evidence. Again, as Rosa Maria said, you need evidence from lots of sources. So in pollution cases, it is often very difficult to make the link between mining or oil operation and actual damage. And so the more observations and a mixture of factual evidence from members of the community as to what has been seen and heard and experienced, combined with expert evidence, is very important. I'll just make 2 other points, if I may. One is that often companies produce environmental impact assessments, and these are often not independent and contain many mistakes. In fact, I have seen examples where the company just copies things from a previous example that make no sense at all in the context in which it was intended. And often, if you have expert assistance, you can attack and discredit the conclusions of environmental impact assessments that are often relied upon by companies. The second point is that, as Peter said, companies do not usually directly say, go and kill someone. And even if they do, they don't shout about it so that everyone can hear. Very often, the most powerful evidence is in the company's own documents, and obtaining that by court order is a very important part of litigation in England or the Netherlands. And very often it is the companies themselves who have the knowledge, who have the records, but they keep it secret until they are forced to disclose them. And so that is another very important aspect. I'll leave the other questions, I think, to Rosa Maria and Peter, but that is just some thoughts based on actual cases that we have brought to court.
Great, thanks a lot. Gracias. La solución completa, ¿no? Estamos hablando de intereses económicos muy fuertes. Puede haber una sentencia y luego
We could have a ruling and then the ruling is not fulfilled. So we know the damage of the environment and not damage to people. And so they really try how to bring together the litigation work that you do to bring cases to justice, but also advocacy work. Because what the ruling does, there could be a ruling from an inter-American system or Colombian court. It could be an opinion of the United Nations. While that also gives you backing, it gives you some support, international support. We're talking about pearls. This is a pearl. How do you use this pearl? How do you use this in a concept of advocacy campaigns? And Amanda talked about those, to linking those legal initiatives, criminal initiatives, with education, mobilization, advocacy work. See, I don't really have an answer to the question on biocultural. One thing that comes to mind is that even if the state does not recognize that there is an entity with their own culture, but of course there are documents in universities, documents that talk about that area. There has to be elements that acknowledge or recognize that this people, Afro or indigenous community, whatever, so we can bring some evidence that maybe that are part of the academia. Just to complete. Sorry that I didn't have time to explain the different levels of responsibility, but something that is really important is that depending on the research strategy or investigation strategy, which is crucial because it will help us to know whether a company is established with more or less responsibility, because that's important, because we have to go beyond just saying that the company played an accidental role. In many cases, that could be the case, but in the case of Chiquita or Drummond, that was not an accidental case. So that relates to due diligence, which is a very dangerous concept. Could be good for a concept that for a company that is committed to human rights, but it also helps to emphasize you don't have a current management system in place, an adequate management place. So when you talk to Drummond about due diligence, that's useless. I mean, everything they did is they thought that out. But I wanted to make a comment. It's really a question. In many cases, when multinational companies they go to new countries, mining companies or whatever, from Dutch companies, Germany, the embassies in those countries, they play a vital role. From from the moment till the agreements are entered into. We recently visited the Colombian embassy in Madrid, and we were told in a confidential manner, but I'm saying it here publicly, that all projects of the Canal de Dique had been signed in the Petro that had visited the embassy, and he had signed. And I'm not a lawyer, and I don't understand much about this evidence and proofs, and to what extent there's complicity. I mean, from the state who is behind those companies. It's really a question that comes to mind, of course, from my ignorance. I wanted to say something. It is true what you're saying. Of course, embassies are in the countries to be able to defend the economic interests of their own countries, but they have to go through human rights, of course, and sometimes they don't have specific cases, but they don't really go into the structural area because that implies something different. So we can analyze the role of the British Embassy or the American Embassy, how they coordinated the military aid, Plan Colombia, the UK Embassy and the USA Embassy, and this battalion, we sent that one here. They had a lot to do with that. And obviously not only the embassies, but the states, their own governments. I don't remember the date, but we're talking about structures, support structures. This from Arauca played out when there were oil companies that were from Spain and from the United States, and they received financing. I don't know whether it was from the states or the companies. So you have a prosecutor within the battalion, maybe investigating the massacres that were being in, and we were detaining lots of peasants, and that was the role of those companies. So that they played the game, and then these agreements of Spain, they entered into so many agreements to build things in Buenaventura and Cauca. That's hidden. They signed those agreements between the Ministry of Foreign Relations and the Ministry of the Interior in Colombia, in Spain, and there's a Spanish consortium building the road to Buenaventura, for example. I have a comment and a question. My first comment relates to Drummond and Cesar. We always talk about this marriage with the marriage of local governments, national governments, and the companies. And when you mentioned Michoacán, I remember that the brother of one of mayor of Guajira is in the Congress right now, and he defends. He is in the traceability of buying land that at the end of the day ended up in the hands of Drummond. So I don't know whether they were co-opting and this was an official that was working for that company. But my question relates more to procedures, and it's what happened to the annulment of the fracking. We filed a lawsuit against the State Council. We carried out some community monitoring of gas emissions, methane gas emission, and other types of gases from the extraction, from the wells. And we brought the results of those tests in the process before the State Council, and they rejected because we didn't respect the custody chain. So I have a huge void. How can you really have the custody chain? How do you respect the custody chain in communities? And how can they be efficient, useful for that litigation that is being carried out, and processes that are driven by communities?
Bueno,
When I want to make something clear, when I refer to things that are new, they're beginning, we need to build a path, and we need to fight that path, because there are a series of scenarios where those discussions have taken place. So if we want to strengthen environmental community workshops, we need to assess the experiences of Peru, especially, which has made significant progress with guides, this Nuki network. Maybe we can confirm that. So we need to sort of build a library. What really the concern is that the library would be so big, and then we'd be too lazy to go and find things. but we do need to be practical
los instrumentos y
in
las
terms of the
herramientas necesarias.
instruments and tools that we
Si
use.
nosotros como abogados y
If
abogadas
we as
a
lawyers,
veces nos cuesta poder
sometimes for us
entrar
it's
de
difficult
fondo
to
en
go
toda
in
esa
depth,
documentación,
you
pues
know,
ahora
into all
imagínense
that
en las comunidades
documentation
de
that we
los
have.
tiempos además que
Just
tienen que
imagine
ser
about the
rápidos,
communities
es la vida.
where communities have to dedicate
Entonces yo
time
no
to
digo que
living.
cogí unas
We
palabras de
have
una teoría
gathered
que decía es
the
que
words of
se
a
necesitaría
leader,
nuestro mínimo
and he said
vital.
our
Entonces
vital
nuestro brindis
life,
jurídico
you know,
a
our life
nosotros
is
vecinos
just
tendríamos que
going down the
estar usando
drain.
para
We
cosas
should be using our
importantes,
time
¿cuál va a
for
ser nuestra
important
próxima
things and not
acción?
for litigation. When
¿Cómo
it's
vamos a
going to
cuidar
be our
nuestras
next
semillas
crop,
nativas?
how are we going to care for our
Entonces
native
hay que clasificar
seeds?
instrumentos.
So we need to
Pero en
classify those
concreto,
instruments. But concretely,
irnos a las experiencias
we need
que
to
ya se han
go to the
sucedido en Perú
experiences that
nos
have
pueden dar
happened in
insumos
Peru.
porque
They
hay
can give us some
organizaciones en Perú que ya
inputs
tienen
because there are
cartillas,
organizations in
que ya
Peru that
tienen
already have
insumos como de pasos,
brochures
el A,
or
B, C.
steps like the
Colóquese
ABC.
los guantes
Place
blancos
the white
y
gloves on your
practicar,
hands
tomando
and
video con la prueba
someone
sin editar,
films
por supuesto,
and the
¿no?
video
Y
will
el
not
otro
be edited
recogiendo la
and
muestra y
the
la
other
muestra se
person
recoge
gathers the
así. La
sample
cadena de
and
custodia
then
es
the
simplemente
custody
llevar el
chain
paso a
is to
paso
do
de
the
la prueba
step
que
by
usted está
step
recogiendo.
of the
Y
evidence
si tú
that you
tendrías,
are
o
gathering.
tengas, no sé, a un
And if you
representante del
invite a
gobierno, pero con esto
representative of
testigo
the
de que
ombudsman
sí,
and he
Diego
is to
estaba grabando este
witness
verdadero
the
acto
video that was
de
being taking,
autoridad
that
ambiental
the
que le está
environmental
entregando a las
authority of the
comunidades indígenas.
community
Ah, pero
was
no, somos
there.
una comunidad campesina,
Oh, we're a
no, pues
peasant
venga a ver,
community,
aprovechemos los
so
contactos con Naciones Unidas y
let's
creamos
take
un
advantage of our
protocolo de
contact with the
intervenidos.
United Nations and let's
Busquemos
ask them to
mentores.
be with us. Let's look for
A ver,
ombudsmen
por
to help us
ejemplo, en
out.
todo esto que hemos hablado es
So
fundamental
when
la
we talk,
información.
if information is vital.
¿Cuál es el
What
mecanismo
is the
más propicio
mechanism,
para obtener
the best
información?
mechanism to obtain information?
Los derechos de petición. Levanten la mano quienes
Petition
ya
rights.
hayamos hecho al menos
Have
un
you
derecho de petición
filed
en
any
nuestra vida.
petition, right to
Bueno,
petition?
una buena cantidad.
Yeah, there's a series.
Lo primerito,
So
primerito que
that's
uno
the
tiene que
first thing
aprender
that we need to
cuando
learn how
entra
to
en
do
estos
when we
debates
begin
es
to
hacer
those
derechos de
debates,
petición.
to do
Hacerlos bien hechecitos para que nos contesten como es, porque también nos
so
podemos contestar mal.
we want
Que me
them, we need to
contestaron
do
mal,
it well
busco una
because
organización
let's find an
ONG, aliada para que de
NGO
pronto
that
le
an
pongamos
ally that
nombrita, que ahí
maybe,
están los ojos
you know,
puestos de
these
colegio de
are, you know,
abogados.
the
Eso a
collective
veces sí, a
CAJAR is
veces
here.
no.
So
Pero no me sirvió la
no,
ONG.
the
Hay una
NGO
clínica
didn't work.
jurídica de una
So let's
ONG,
go
ahí
into a
conozco a
clinic,
José. José, venga, usted nos puede
a
presentar
legal
este derecho de
clinic.
petición para
Oh,
que nos den
Jose,
hasta la
could
tarde, que
you
pobre no
give
va mucho
me,
tiempo, ¿sí?
could you submit this,
Y
or could you file
no
this
sirvió la
right to
clínica
petition?
jurídica. Uy, un
No, then
congresista
Jose didn't work.
aliado,
So
un
we need an
congresista
ally, a
amigo, pues
congressman,
por
the
suerte,
friend
porque
in
en todos los
Congress,
congresistas les contestan más rápido.
because
Y a los
Congress
congresistas ya
do
no piensan dos veces
they
para dar la
think twice
información
on whether they
suelta o
want
mal
to
o lo que
give
sea.
them the right or wrong information.
No crean, miren, no todo es
Not
negativo.
everything
O
is
sea,
negative.
mira, en este
In
mundo
this
de
world
situación desde lo
where
jurídico,
we face
yo
different
entiendo
legal
que tengamos
situations,
muchas
I
preocupaciones. Incluso
understand
yo
that we
misma
have lots
a
of
mí misma me
concerns.
han dicho como
I
Rosa
have
María, por
said,
Dios,
you
pero
know,
digamos algo positivo
Rosa
porque es que
Maria,
usted
please
todo
say
nos
something
dice negativo.
positive
Yo les
because
digo, no, al contrario, todo
no, on
lo
the
que yo hablo es
contrary,
muy
everything
positivo
I talk
porque
about is
soy una abogada
positive
al servicio del pueblo.
because I'm a lawyer who's
Podría
defending the
ser una
people.
abogada por
I could
allá,
be a
no sé, viendo
lawyer
una olla por
from
ahí, para mí es
some.
positivo
So
estar
for
aquí.
me, it's just positive being
Y
here,
que el colectivo de abogados y
and
abogadas
that
que
the
exista también para
collective
que,
exists,
así que ustedes
and
estén
so
aquí
that
también.
you're here. That's important,
Pero
and that's
a veces
positive. But
concentrarnos en el
sometimes
punto
to
negro en la hoja
focus on
blanca
the black
no nos
dot
permite
on the
soñar.
white paper does not allow us to
Y una de
dream.
las tareas
And one of the
fundamentales
tasks that
también en
we
los
have
procesos organizativos
in
tenemos es
this
no perder la
organization, we
esperanza y
can't
la
lose
capacidad de
hope
soñar.
and we can't
Porque ahí sí
lose our
perdemos.
ability to dream.
Porque
Otherwise, we're
a
lost.
donde sobre todo estas
Because
empresas y este
especially
sistema de
when this
consumo quiere llegar
consumptions,
es a
the
que
system
tengas
of
miedo
consumption, they want you to
siempre
be always
y que
afraid
pierdas la
and
capacidad de
that you
soñar.
lose your ability to dream.
Porque quieren que vivamos
Because
como
they
entes,
want us
como
to live like
patitos, a un solo lado.
dummies, walking
Y
just in
entonces,
one direction.
diferente, ya, ahí nos
So
estamos
when we are
incomodando.
different, we are being uncomfortable.
Pero quería cerrar esto
So I wanted
para
to wrap
decirles
this up
que se me fue la paloma otra vez.
and say, oh, sorry,
No, positivo.
what's
El
positive.
derecho de petición
So
porque vamos a
the
conseguir
right to
montón de
petition,
información
where
de
we're we're going to get a lot of information that we need. this wasn't good. So I go to a congressman or a congresswoman, and we do have allies in Congress. Maybe they're not perfect. I don't know.
me atrevo a decir dos,
But I
el
can
resto,
talk about two
no sé.
who are almost perfect, I
Esos
think.
dos
But those
congresistas,
two
esos dos congresistas
congressmen or
son
women
aliados,
are allies
porque lo mínimo es que nos colaboran con derechos
because
de
they
petición de
help
nación.
us with
¿Mm?
this
Y está
request.
también la
And also
herramienta
we
que
have
está en
the
discusión,
tool
que
that is
tenemos que
under discussion, that
estudiarla,
we need to
tenemos que checarla
study,
y
and
afincarla,
we
que es
need
esto
to
del
analyze it
acuerdo
in
de Escazú,
detail, which is the Escazú
porque se pone
Agreement,
como que la Corte
because the
Constitucional está ahí
Constitutional
pendiente, pero
Court
que
is
nos
there,
ponen un estándar muy
but
alto es lo de la información.
the information
Para las
is
comunidades
quite important.
indígenas,
So for
cuando
indigenous
dicen
communities,
consulta
when
previa,
they talk about prior consultation,
libre,
if, la,
informada,
prior, and
y no
informed.
nos hemos preguntado con
And we
seriedad qué
haven't really
significan
asked
esas tres
ourselves what
palabritas.
those three words really
Entonces,
mean.
ahí también hay un marco de
So
cosas por
here we
valorar y
have
por ver.
things that we need to value and
Y
analyze.
otra prueba
And another
claro, que
evidence,
podemos tener como tarea, Susi, una tarea,
we have
es
Susie some
poner como
homework.
unas consideraciones
So
alrededor
let's
de
write some
cuáles ya se usan y han resultado
which
positivas,
have been
cuáles
used and
están
what are
incluso
and
a
they
ser
have been
peleadas
and
como
they are
los paneles
positive.
de monitoreo
What
ambiental
is
comunitario.
ongoing
Una que a mí me
and
gusta mucho
one that I really
son las
like
inspecciones
is
judiciales.
legal inspections. That's something that I really
Sí.
like.
A los jueces y a cualquier
Judges
operador,
and any
incluso a
operator
los funcionarios
and
públicos que
even
tienen las
public
grandes
officials
oficinas,
here from
nos
the
toca
large offices,
sacarlos al
we
territorio
need to take them
y
out
toca
to
que
the
se unten
territory,
las botas de
and
polvo.
they need to get dust on in their shoes.
Claro, es que en Estados Unidos
In the
hubo un
United
ejercicio
States,
de una comunidad en una
you see
audiencia
a
de esas
community and
y
you see a
pusieron
hearing,
agua y dijeron,
and
ah, el agua no está contaminada, tómese
the
esta.
water is not contaminated.
Se
Well,
la
drink this
toma o
water.
se la toma, si
You
no, no
wanna,
vamos de aquí.
and if you don't drink this
No, pues
water, we
señora, yo
won't
pues
walk
no me la
away.
voy a
No,
tomar
I'm not
porque
gonna
se puede
drink it
esa agua
because it looks
estaba contaminada de
awful.
petróleo.
It was contaminated. It was
Bueno,
filled with
entonces
oil.
las inspecciones
So
judiciales,
legal
porque cada vez
inspections,
más hay un reto de
because
sacar a
we
esos
do have a
operadores
challenge
judiciales de los
of we
escritorios
need to bring those
o de las grandes ciudades
officials
del
from
pueblo
the cities and we need to take them to the
y a
territory
los entes de control, por
and also
supuesto.
control entities, of course.
Y también creo que hay unas pruebas
And I think
fundamentales
there's some basic
que
proofs
hay
or
que
evidence
recogerlas con
that
unos
we need
insumos.
to collect
Y
them
entonces ahí también
with,
podríamos
so then
compartir.
maybe there we could also
Espero
share.
que no sea un material que los
I hope
abrume,
this is
pero
something that
hay una
overwhelms you,
metodología que
but there
se
is a
llama la metodología
methodology
COBRA.
that it's called the
Y es una
COBRA
metodología
methodology.
que se le
And
entrega a
this
una comunidad para
methodology, you give it
decirles,
to some
estos
communities.
son los
So
pasos.
these are
Paso
the
1,
steps,
paso 2,
step
paso
1,
3,
step
paso
2,
4.
step 3, and step 4.
Pero nunca olviden
But don't forget
trabajo va a
that
servir
nothing of that
si
work
no
that you've
está
done will be useful
muy clave
unless
la práctica del
you have
fortalecimiento
this
organizacional.
strong line of
Porque un día
capacity
usted va a
building
presentar
in the
un documento
organization,
a la
because
Corte
one day you
Constitucional
submit a
como
document
la
before the
mujer
Constitutional
provincial,
Court, as was the case with the women in
con todos los
Provincial,
elementos,
and it
todo
contained
absolutamente
all the
todo.
different
Y al
elements.
otro día,
Everything was
las
there. And on the
autoridades
next day, the authorities
presentaron otra
of these
carta
reservation,
diciéndole
indigenous
a la Corte que
reservations,
eso que
submitted
estaban
another
haciendo esas
letter
mujeres
telling the
era
court that what these women were saying
Entonces,
was
uno
not
está
true.
metiendo mucho esfuerzo en esto para que
So
veamos
you cannot be wearing out yourself on this for, if things like this happen. Okay, just 1 second. Just an announcement for what is going to happen tomorrow. Because we're normally speaking of evidence and proof and very technical experts' views, but it's just what we said before. The authorities, the environmental authorities, should be respected as the authority. There was this court decision in the Caribbean, and we will be hearing about this tomorrow. In this case, the court, even though it's not a Colombian court, decides or establishes that the proof, the observations of the community, there are fewer trees, etc., that's a proof. And you don't have to go and measure how many trees were lost. So going back to Rosa Maria, we can use these decisions even from different instances, to quote-unquote educate judges and prosecutors to tell them this is what is happening in other countries. You should go there. And this is what I said in my presentation. And I must say that the idea around this strategy is to involve the company as an entity and not just the individuals, because I think it's important to establish the responsibility of the company and that of the individual, even though we know very well that in the criminal side in Colombia and in many other countries, the legal personalities, there's no jurisdiction for them on the criminal side. But I think it's important to establish when they acted as criminal entities. Well, I think that it's enough. We still have the legal workshops or the legal clinics ahead, and I imagine that you may want to take some rest this afternoon and go out to dinner, etc. So I don't know if perhaps it's good to take a break now. Otherwise, it's going to be too much. But instead of making it 30 minutes, let's take a 15-minute break. And after that, we will have our legal clinic that was prepared by the team of lawyers here, Aviel Melendez and CAJAR, that has contributed some inputs, and Francisco and Peter and Rosa Maria. And Rosa Maria will be moderating it. So we will split ourselves in 3 groups, but let's all come back to the room for Rosa Maria to explain the contents of the clinic. And Richard, we're saying goodbye to you now. Thank you very much for being with us, for joining us, and for your patience. And especially, Richard, thank you so much for supporting Roots to Justice, because we're here thanks to him. So, big hug, Richard. Gracias.